The story of the world's first video game is not what you think. Most people would point to Tennis for Two, created in 1958 by physicist and engineer William Higgs, but that's only partly true. You see, Tennis for Two was groundbreaking for sure, but it wasn't the first, not even close. In fact, there were dozens of games before it that we don't know about because they were never finished. And the one that almost was finished, well, its existence was forgotten until recently. Today, if you want to play the world's first video game, you have to make an appointment with a museum curator in Philadelphia. And even then, they might say, no, that's because the oldest surviving computer game in existence is OX, also known as Noughts and Crosses or Tic-Tac-Toe. It's a simple game played on a cathode ray tube, which was common in those days. The player controls a cursor and takes turns marking the center of the screen with either an X or an O, the goal being to get 3 in a row like this. But that's where things get complicated, because OXO wasn't just played against another person. No, it was played against a computer. Now, that doesn't sound too hard, but back in 1952, computers were enormous. This one, the Manchester Mark I, took up an entire room and had only one purpose: to calculate ballistic trajectories for artillery. It was basically a giant calculator. So, the idea of a computer playing tic-tac-toe against you seems absurd. Like, why bother? Well, it's all about how the machine learned. You see, the game was played by manually moving switches on the Mark I. Each switch represented a different part of the circuitry, and when moved, flipped a corresponding bit from off to on or vice versa. At first, the switches would just change randomly, making the game unplayable. But over time, the scientists at Manchester University who were working on the Mark I noticed something interesting. Certain switch configurations led to more wins than others. Eventually, they had enough data to program these configurations into the machine's memory, and thus OXO was born. It wasn't perfect, though. The computer could only remember 5 moves, meaning it couldn't beat you, but it was smart enough to rarely lose, making it a worthy opponent. Still, despite it being the world's first, no one knows exactly who created OXO. Some say it was Alex S. Douglas, a mathematician who had the idea but died before seeing it finished. Others say it was Christopher Strachey, who was able to get the Mark I to play checkers as well. But most say it was a team effort. After all, it took dozens of programmers years to get the Mark I to play tic-tac-toe properly. And that brings us to the untold story of the world's second video game, space travel. Just like OX, space travel was played on a cathode ray tube and it was programmed into the Mark I. But unlike tic-tac-toe, space travel was never finished. Why? Well, it has everything to do with Alan Turing. If you haven't heard of him, he's basically the father of theoretical computer science and artificial intelligence. He is most famous for cracking the Enigma code during World War II and for creating the Turing test, which measures a machine's ability to exhibit intelligent behavior equivalent to or indistinguishable from that of a human. But it was also one of the first people to design a video game. In 1951, he wrote a program for the Mark I that simulated a ship traveling through space. On the screen, the ship was represented by a crosshair, and its direction was controlled by 2 dials, one for throttle, which determined the speed, and one for steering, which changed the direction. The goal was to navigate your ship safely, avoiding the walls while watching out for meteoroids that occasionally appeared on the screen. Now here's the thing. Unlike tic-tac-toe, where the computer had all the information it needed to play, space travel required the programmer to input new variables constantly. Meteoroid speed, wall position, score. This made it much more difficult, but also much more fun. And that's why it's so strange that the game was never finished. You see? After finishing his program, Turing left Manchester to work at the National Physical Laboratory in London, where he started his own research into artificial intelligence. And then, tragically, he died in 1954 under mysterious circumstances. Some say he was killed for being gay, others that he simply took his own life. But what we do know is that he disappeared just as space travel was taking off. There are several documented attempts to recreate the game based on Turing's notes, but none were ever successful. Then, in 2001, a man named Paul Saratops thought he finally cracked the code. Using the original documentation and some educated guesses, he managed to get the Mark I to simulate a ship flying around in space. But when he tried to add meteoroids, the game crashed. For the next 17 years, the code remained unfinished until one day, a developer found a mistake. One single character was preventing the meteoroids from spawning. Once it was fixed, space travel was finally complete. The world's second video game worked just as Alan Turing imagined it, but unfortunately, it was too late. By the time it was finished, the Mark I had long been retired and video games were already mainstream. If space travel had come out just 2 years earlier, it might have been a hit. But by 2080, no one cared. Luckily, though, the story doesn't end here. A few months after space travel was completed, a group of students at the University of Cambridge got wind of the project and asked if they could borrow the Mark I for a little experiment. When the NPL said yes, they brought the massive computer to Cambridge and reprogrammed it to play space travel too. The graphics were improved. The gameplay was faster paced, and there was even an option for multiplayer. It was so good that the NPL demanded the students return the Mark I so they could use it for their own research. The students complied, but not before making a backup. They copied all of the Mark I's programs onto punch cards, including space travel too. Then they handed the Mark I back and went home. Fast forward 66 years, and those same punch cards were discovered in a box in Cambridge's computer lab. They were thought to be nothing more than an antique until researchers realized they were looking at the world's first video game sequel. Now it can be played online. All you have to do is go to the Computer History Museum website and click play. The game will load in a new browser window and you can take control. Use the arrow keys to steer and control your ship and press enter to start a new game. As you can see, Space Travel 2 is pretty primitive, but it's still fun to play and surprisingly addictive. As someone who grew up playing Call of Duty, I didn't think I'd enjoy such a basic game, but I'm hooked. Here's the thing. Even though Space Travel 2 came out later than Tennis for Two, it was actually developed earlier. And that's why some people consider it to be the world's first video game. Tennis for Two, meanwhile, was developed independently by William Hick. He was a scientist at Brookhaven National Laboratory and wanted to build something that would attract visitors to the lab's public exhibition. He achieved this with a cathode ray tube connected to an The idea was that visitors could play tennis by swinging a net back and forth. But like all good video games, people didn't play as the net. Instead, they controlled the paddle and tried to hit the ball back as many times as possible. After a few weeks, he added a scoring system and adjustable difficulty settings. But as far as video games go, that's about it. There were no graphics, no sound effects, not even a timer. That last part was my favorite. Even so, Tennis for Two was revolutionary and paved the way for decades of sports video games, but it was also very limited. It could only be played on site at Brookhaven, and only during certain hours. But once word got out, people traveled from all over to play. One of them was a man named Steve Russell, who was a student at MIT. When he heard about the game, he took the train over to Brookhaven, played Tennis for Two, and then went straight to MIT, where he built his own version. His version was called Tennis for Three and was played on a 3-inch. Unlike the previous games, it featured real-time graphics and sound effects. That's why some people call it the world's first interactive computer game. But that's also why it's so confusing. If you ask a computer scientist, they'll tell you that OXO was the first video game. If you ask a video game developer, they'll tell you it was Tennis for Two. The truth is, both are right. The only problem is they're talking about completely different things. OXO was a digital game played on a digital display. Meanwhile, Tennis for Two was an analog game played on an analog display. Think of it this way. If you wanted to build a car, you could either use the first steam engine or the first internal combustion engine. Both are right, but neither really answers the question. The same is true of video games. It all depends on what you consider to be a video game. Personally, I think it should be something that can be coded and run on a computer. If that's the case, then OXO wins hands down. But if it needs to look like a video game, then Tennis 4-2 gets my vote. Either way, they're both great games and definitely worth playing. So go ahead, spend a few minutes reliving history, but don't spend too long because as cool as they are, they're nothing compared to the games we have today.